The taxi was still there, northeast corner of Washington and Cherry in Presidio Heights, San Francisco, just before 10 at night on the 11th of October, 1969. The driver was a young man named Paul Stein, 29 years old, a doctoral student at San Francisco State, driving the cab to pay his way through school. He dropped off his last fare, gotten the call for another one, picked up a man on Geary Street, and driven him into Presidio Heights. The fare was a single bullet to the right side of his head. 3 teenagers across the street saw the whole thing. They watched the man calmly wipe down the cab, tear off a piece of Paul's shirt, and walk away into the night. Anyone watching this who lived in the Bay Area at that time, you remember what came next. You remember the letters that started arriving at the Chronicle. You remember a name that scared half of Northern California for years on end. The man who killed Paul Stein that night called himself the Zodiac. And for 56 years, nobody has ever been able to tell you who he really was. The case is still open. The killer was never caught. But on December 5th, 2020, something happened that almost nobody talked about at the time. 3 men in 3 different countries, sitting in their living rooms during a pandemic, finally got the Zodiac to say something back. After 51 years of silence, his last code finally talked. And what it said is the reason I want to tell you this whole story again, because the Zodiac case isn't really about who did it anymore. It's about everything we kept finding after we stopped looking. The story really starts on the 20th of December, 1968, 2 days before Christmas, 5 days before a kid named David Faraday would have turned 18. He was a senior at Vallejo High School, a Boy Scout, the all-American kind of student, the kind of boy that teachers remember decades later. About 2 weeks earlier, at a church function, he had met a girl named Betty Lou Jensen. She was 16, an honor student at Hogan High School, 3 blocks from her family's home. Betty had never been on a date before. Her older sister had given her some advice: bring the boy home first, let your parents meet him before you go anywhere. So, on the night of December 20th, David showed up at her front door at 8 o'clock sharp. He met her parents. He shook her father's hand. He promised them both, before they left the house, that he would have her home by 11 that night. They believed him. They watched the 2 of them walk out to the car together. Betty wore a purple dress that night, a small Christmas bell brooch pinned to her white collar. They drove away in David's mother's car, a 2-tone Rambler station wagon. Her parents stood at the door and watched them go. This was their first date. They went to a friend's house first, then to the Christmas concert at Hogan High School. Then somewhere along the way that night, they made a different decision. They drove out to a quiet stretch of road between Vallejo and Berryessa on the city limits, a gravel turnout next to the gate of an old water pumping station, a place teenagers in town just called Lover's Lane. They parked at 10:15 that night. A young woman driving past with her boyfriend recognized the Rambler, saw David and Betty inside talking. She drove on. Back at the Jensen house, the parents were trying not to look at the clock too often. 11 came and went. At about 11:15 that night, a woman named Stella Medeiros was driving home along Lake Herman Road. Her headlights swept across the gravel turnout. She saw 2 figures lying on the ground. She kept driving, found a police officer in town, brought him back. By the time they arrived, the rest of the night was already over for those 2 children. Betty Lou was lying on the gravel about 28 feet from the car. She had been shot 5 times in the back. The detectives who walked the scene later realized something: those wounds meant she had been running, trying to get away from the man with the gun. David was still alive when the officers arrived, just barely. A retired Berryessa detective named Pierre Bidou would describe it years later in an interview. He said you could still see the boy's breath in the cold December air. He died on the way to the hospital. Back at the Jensen home, the parents were still waiting up. The next morning, the Vallejo Times-Herald ran the story on the front page. Nobody knew yet that this was the start of something. The detectives, Sergeant Les Lundblad, Deputy Russell Butterbach, they treated it like what it looked like, a double homicide, probably someone who knew Betty Lou. They worked the case the way you worked a case in 1968, driving around, knocking on doors, talking to high school kids in the area. By summer of the following year, the leads had all dried up. The case was filed away with the other unsolved files. And then the second attack happened, 2 miles down the road from where David and Betty Lou had died. The 4th of July, 1969, just past midnight, Blue Rock Springs Park, another Lover's Lane, this one in Vallejo. A young woman named Darlene Ferrin was sitting in her car with a friend, 19-year-old Michael Majot. They were just talking. Darlene was 22 years old, a waitress at Terry's restaurant, married. the mother of a baby girl named Dina, the oldest of 10 children, 8 girls and 2 boys. Her younger sister Pam would tell a reporter decades later that Darlene had been her idol growing up. Another car pulled in behind them in the parking lot. A man got out with a flashlight, walked up to the passenger side window. The couple thought he was a police officer doing his rounds. Without saying a single word to either of them, he opened fire. Then he walked back to his car, opened the door, did something they couldn't quite see in the dark, and came back and shot them both again. Darlene died at the hospital. Mike Mageau survived, with serious wounds to his face, neck, and chest. 40 minutes after the shooting, a man called the Vallejo Police Department from a payphone 2 blocks away from the station itself. He said, "I want to report a double murder. If you go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway, you will find kids in a brown car." And then he said something that changed the case completely. He said, "I also killed those kids last year." And then he hung up the phone. That was the moment the police understood. The 2 cases, Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs, were one case. 4 weeks later, in the first week of August, 3 Bay Area newspapers, the Chronicle, the Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald, each received an envelope. Inside each one was the same handwritten letter, written in the same clean printed handwriting. Each letter contained details about the killings that only the killer himself could possibly have known. And each letter was signed with a symbol that millions of Americans would recognize before that decade was over, a circle with a cross drawn through it. Like the crosshairs of a rifle scope, each of the 3 letters also contained one piece of a much longer hidden message, a code, 408 characters of jumbled symbols. The writer demanded that the newspapers print the code on the front page. If they refused, he wrote, he would kill more people. The editors of the San Francisco Chronicle faced a decision that has haunted American journalism ever since. Print the words of a serial killer, and you give him exactly the publicity he wants. Refuse to print them, and the people in your city might die for it. They printed them. A school teacher down in Salinas named Donald Hardin, working with his wife Betty at their kitchen table, broke the code in less than a week. The message wasn't a confession. It wasn't a name. It was a man boasting that killing was more fun than hunting wild game, because man, he said, was the most dangerous animal of all to kill. A few days after that, the killer wrote to the Examiner once again. He opened the letter with a phrase that became famous all on its own. This is the Zodiac speaking, and from that point forward, that was his name. He had named himself in front of all of us, and he would spend the next 5 years making sure we never forgot the sound of it. 6 weeks after that letter, on the afternoon of the 27th of September, 1969, a young couple drove up to Lake Berryessa in Napa County for an afternoon picnic. They were both college students at Pacific Union College, just up the hill from the lake. Brian Hartnell was 20 years old. Cecilia Shepard was 22. She had been born in a small town called Newsvid in southern India, and her family had moved to California when she was a young girl. Brian and Cecilia had dated briefly before. They were just old friends now. They picked a small island connected to the shore by a sand spit, spread out a blanket, started reading. After a while, Cecilia looked up and noticed a man standing behind a tree about 30 feet away from them. "Just watching," she told Brian quietly. They both pretended not to see him. The man waited a few more minutes. Then he stepped out from behind the tree. He was wearing a black executioner's hood pulled down over his head, with clip-on sunglasses over the eye holes. On the front of his bib was the same crosshair symbol that had been on every letter to the Chronicle. He had a gun, he had a long knife, and he had pre-cut lengths of plastic clothesline he brought with him. He told them he was an escaped convict, said he just needed their car and money to get to Mexico. He had Cecilia tie Brian's hands, then he tied hers himself, and then he took out the knife. Brian was stabbed 6 times in the back. Cecilia was stabbed at least 10 times. The man walked back up the path to the road, drew the crosshair symbol on the door of Brian's car in black felt-tip pen, and wrote the dates of all 3 attacks beneath it. A father and son fishing nearby heard the screams. They ran for help. Brian somehow was still alive when the Rangers arrived. He'd untied Cecilia's ropes with his teeth. Cecilia was still breathing too, though she would lapse into a coma in the ambulance and die 2 days later. A few weeks after that, Brian Hartnell gave an interview from his hospital bed to a Bay Area television station. And the thing he said about the man who had attacked him is something that has stayed with me for a long time. He said, "I don't think he was acting under his complete consciousness." He said, "If you don't mind me using the word sick, you can't hold this against him." He said the only thing he was really worried about was that the man would do it again. Brian was 20 years old. He was lying in a hospital bed with 6 stab wounds in his back, and that's what he chose to say. 2 weeks later, the Zodiac killed Paul Stein in his cab at Washington and Cherry, and then he sat down somewhere in the Bay Area, and he wrote another letter to the Chronicle, and he sent along a piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt as proof. And he started taunting the police openly. Now, I want to take you to the most important moment in this whole case. Maybe the moment that decided everything. Because if you ask anyone who worked on this investigation what their biggest regret is, this is the one they always come back to. October 11th, 1969, just before 10 at night, the teenagers across the street had called the police about a minute after the Zodiac walked away from Paul Stein's cab. 2 SFPD patrol officers in a squad car were close, only a few blocks away on Presidio Avenue. Their names were Don Fuch and Eric Zelms. Fuch was the senior officer, a 1968 nominee for Officer of the Year, held in high regard inside the department. Zelms was a young rookie, just a few months on the job. They turned left onto Jackson Street and started speeding toward the crime scene that the dispatcher had given them. About 3 minutes after the shooting, 2 blocks from the cab, on the sidewalk on Jackson Street, they passed a white man walking east, heavyset, about 40 years old, glasses, a reddish-brown crew cut. Donald Fuch would later describe him as having a strange, shuffling walk, like he was trying not to be noticed. The man turned suddenly into a stairway leading up to the front of one of the houses. Fuch slowed the car. He looked at him for maybe 5 or 6 seconds, and then he kept driving, because the police dispatcher, in the chaos of the call coming in, had given them the wrong description of the suspect. The dispatcher had said the killer was an African-American male. The man on the sidewalk was white. So Fuch and Zelms drove past him, continued on toward the cab. The man on the sidewalk walked up the stairs of the house, turned, and disappeared into the entrance to the Presidio. A few weeks later, the Zodiac wrote to the Chronicle and bragged about the encounter. He described the police car. He described what the officers had said and done. He even claimed he had spoken to them, told them he had seen a man with a gun running the other way, and that they had thanked him for it. Donald Fuch would deny that part for the rest of his life. He said they passed the man on the sidewalk and never stopped. Either way, the rest of it lined up. 2 San Francisco police officers had been face to face with one of the most wanted men in America that night, and they had let him walk away. Stay with me here, because I want to come back to this story in 51 years, because while everybody was arguing about who the Zodiac was and writing books about it and making movies about it, 3 men nobody had ever heard of were quietly working on something else. They were working on the code. The Zodiac sent a second cipher to the Chronicle in November 1969, 340 characters of symbols, the Z340 they called it. The first cipher had been broken in a week by a school teacher in Salinas. The second one was different. It would not break. Cryptographers at the FBI tried, cryptographers at the CIA tried, amateur codebreakers tried for decades, nothing worked. The cipher sat there for 51 years, mocking everyone who looked at it. And then in 2020, the world shut down, and 3 men found themselves with time on their hands. A software developer in Virginia named David Aronchak, a mathematician in Melbourne, Australia named Sam Blake, a computer programmer in Belgium named Jarl van Eyck. They had all been working on the Z340 for years, separately and then together. And then COVID hit. Sam Blake was locked down in his home in Melbourne for 112 days straight. Mandatory masks, 1 hour outside per day. The rest of the time stuck inside. He used the time to write a program that generated more than 650,000 variations of the cipher. He sent them all to David Aronchak in Virginia, who ran them through Jarl van Eyck's decryption software. And on the 3rd of December, 2020, after 51 years and 1 week of silence, the Zodiac's last cipher started to break. On December 5th, the 3 of them sent the solution to the FBI's Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit. A few days later, the FBI confirmed it. They put out a public statement saying so. The Zodiac's 340-character cipher had finally been read. And what did it say? After half a century of waiting, after thousands of investigators and amateurs trying to figure it out, here is what the Zodiac wrote with all of his usual misspellings, and I'm reading it almost exactly the way he put it down on that page in 1969. I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the TV show, which brings up a point about me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber, because it will send me to paradise all the sooner, because I now have enough slaves to work for me. That was it. That was the message. 51 years of silence, the greatest unsolved cipher in modern crime. And what the Zodiac had been holding back all those years was just more of the same. Mockery, ego, the same boasting he had been writing in every other letter the whole time. But here is the thing. The TV show he was talking about, the one he said wasn't him, that was a real broadcast. October 22nd, 1969, KGO television. The Jim Dunbar Show. Anyone in the Bay Area who was old enough to remember that morning probably remembers that morning very clearly. The famous attorney Melvin Belly, the same lawyer who had defended Jack Ruby a few years earlier in Dallas, was the guest. A man calling himself the Zodiac had phoned the station. The station put him on the air. Half the Bay Area was listening live. He stayed on the line for almost 2 hours. Belly kept trying to get him to surrender. The caller kept hanging up and calling back. 54 times. He eventually agreed to meet Belly at a location in Daly City. He never showed up. And it later turned out the caller hadn't been the real Zodiac at all. He was a mental patient at Napa State Hospital named Eric Weil. The three people who had actually heard the real Zodiac's voice, Brian Hartnell from Lake Berryessa, and two police dispatchers who had answered his phone calls, listened to the recording afterward. They all agreed it wasn't him. And here is what we know now, more than half a century later, because of the cipher David Aronchak and his team finally cracked. The real Zodiac was listening that morning. He heard the imposter pretending to be him on live television. And it bothered him enough to put it in code. That wasn't me on the TV show. That was the first thing he wanted us to know. Even when he wasn't speaking publicly anymore, he was watching, he was reading, he was listening. He cared what people thought of him. He was, in his own twisted way, paying attention to all of us. Now let me come back to that other moment, the one I told you to stay with me on. Officer Eric Zelms, the rookie partner riding with Don Fuch that night on Jackson Street. He was 22 years old. He had only been on the force a few months. He may or may not have looked at the Zodiac that night. Don Fuch spent decades insisting the encounter had only lasted a few seconds. Years later, when he finally talked to a documentary crew about it, he said he could still picture the man's face. And he believed in the end that it was the Zodiac. He took that with him for the rest of his life. But Eric Zelms never got the chance to think about it the way Don Fuch did. Because on New Year's morning, 1970, less than 3 months after that night on Jackson Street, Eric Zelms was killed in the line of duty. He had been responding to a robbery in progress in San Francisco. The men who killed him were caught and convicted. They served their time. But Eric Zelms never got to see the composite sketch that came out years later. He never got to read the books. He never got to see the movies. He never got to wonder the way his partner did, whose face he had passed in the dark that night. If you ever watched the opening of the original Dirty Harry movie from 1971, the one Clint Eastwood made, you'll see a memorial wall of San Francisco police officers killed in the line of duty. And one of the names carved into that wall is Eric A. Zelms. He was 22 years old. Meanwhile, the Zodiac was still writing, still mailing letters to the Chronicle, still threatening to blow up school buses full of children. Anyone who lived in the Bay Area in those years probably remembers what that felt like. Parents driving their own children to school, police escorts, helicopters overhead. The detective who would carry this case for the rest of his career was a man named Dave Toschi, San Francisco homicide. He worked the Stein murder from the night it happened. Toschi had a particular style about him, bow ties, plaid suits, an upside-down shoulder holster. He stood out. Steve McQueen actually copied that holster and a lot of Toschi's mannerisms for the movie Bullet, which had come out in 1968, the same year as the Lake Herman Road killings. A few years later, when Clint Eastwood made Dirty Harry, the character of Harry Callahan was modeled on Toschi too. The Zodiac case was the case of his life. He filled 8 filing cabinets with potential suspects. He went back to the corner of Washington and Cherry on the anniversary of the Stein murder almost every year for as long as he was on the force. He told a reporter once that the case had given him an ulcer. He never caught the man. Toschi was eventually pulled off the case in 1978 after a scandal involving some letters he had foolishly written praising himself. He was reassigned to the robbery detail. He retired from the force in 1985. He died in 2018. He was 86 years old. The Zodiac kept writing for another 5 years after the Stein murder. He wrote to the Chronicle. He wrote to Paul Avery, the crime reporter who was covering the case from the inside. He wrote to Melvin Belly, the celebrity attorney. He sent Halloween cards. He sent threats. And then, in 1974, he stopped. The last letter most experts agree on came in January of that year. He wrote to the Chronicle to give his review of a movie he had recently seen at the theater. The movie was The Exorcist. He wrote that he thought it was, and these were his exact words, the best satirical comedy he had ever seen. And then he was gone. No more letters, no more murders that anyone could definitively link to him, No claims of responsibility for anything else. The Zodiac, who had spent 5 years making sure the entire Bay Area knew his name, simply stopped speaking. And the silence that followed has lasted more than 50 years. Now I want to take you somewhere else for a few minutes. Because if you lived in California through those decades, you know that the Zodiac wasn't the only one. There was another man working the same state at almost the same time doing similar things. And his story ended very differently from this one. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. He was a former police officer. He had served on the force in Exeter, California, and then in Auburn. He started out as a burglar. Then he became a serial rapist. By the time he was finished in 1986, he had committed at least 13 murders and over 50 rapes. For decades, nobody connected the cases. The crimes were spread across multiple counties, multiple jurisdictions. Some called him the East Area Rapist. Some called him the original Night Stalker. He stopped killing in 1986 and seemingly disappeared, the same way the Zodiac had disappeared a decade earlier. The author Michelle McNamara spent years working that case from the outside, just like Robert Graysmith had done with the Zodiac. She gave the killer the name he is known by today. She called him the Golden State Killer. She died before he was caught. Her book was published after her death. And then in April of 2018, something happened that should have been impossible. The Sacramento County Sheriff's Office held a press conference. They announced they had arrested a 72-year-old former police officer named Joseph DeAngelo. They had identified him through a genealogy website called GED Match. Investigators had taken DNA from a 1980 rape kit and uploaded it to the same kind of genealogy database where regular people search for their long-lost cousins. They got back 10 or 20 distant relatives of the killer. They built a family tree of about 1,000 people, and they narrowed it down to one man. On August 21, 2020, Joseph DeAngelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He sat in a wheelchair wearing a white surgical mask. For 3 days, the survivors and the family members of his victims came to the courtroom and stood in front of him and told him their stories. A woman named Jane Carson Sandler, who had been raped in her home in 1976 while her 3-year-old son slept beside her, looked at him across the courtroom. She said, "I was frozen in fear beyond description." And on the last day, Joseph DeAngelo finally stood up out of his wheelchair. He took off his mask, he looked at the people he had hurt, and he said, "I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I have hurt." The mothers of his victims got to hear him say those words. The fathers got to hear him say those words decades later, but they got to hear them. That is something the families of David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, and Paul Stein will never have. The parents of Darlene Ferrin both passed away without ever knowing who killed their daughter. The Faradays, the Jensens, the Shepards, the Steins, every one of those families ran out of time. There is one more story I want to tell you before we close this out, because it shows you what closure actually looks like in a case like this and how long it takes. On Labor Day weekend, 1970, a young nurse named Donna Lass disappeared from her job at the Sahara Tahoe Casino in State Line, Nevada. She was 25 years old, originally from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. She had just rented a new apartment on the California side of the lake the day before she vanished. She left behind a new car, a bank account, a closet full of clothes. The next day, her landlord and her employer both got phone calls. The man on the phone said Donna had left town suddenly because of a family emergency. It was a lie. Some investigators came to believe she might have been the Zodiac's last victim. There was a postcard sent to the Chronicle a few months later that referenced her disappearance, but it was never proven. For decades, Donna's family searched. Her sister Mary came to the lake in 1970 and looked for 2 weeks. They never found her. Then in 1986, a skull was discovered in the mountains. The county didn't have the technology to identify it. They preserved it. They waited. In December of 2023, 5 decades after Donna disappeared, the Placer County Sheriff's Office sent that skull to the California Department of Justice for DNA testing. They matched it to a sample her sister had given 5 years earlier. The skull was Donna Lass. Donna's family had waited 53 years for someone to come and tell them where she was. That is what closure looks like in a case from this era. Half a century of waiting, a skull in an evidence locker, a sister who never gave up sending DNA samples, and a phone call. Finally, in 2023, the Zodiac case is still open. The FBI's San Francisco division has it listed as an ongoing investigation. The case is open in Riverside. The case is open in Napa. There have been theories Arthur Lee Allen, the Vallejo schoolteacher who died in 1992, Gary Francis Post, a house painter who died in 2018. Volunteer groups have come forward with new evidence. Documentaries have aired. Books have been written. Just last year, a Netflix series called This Is the Zodiac Speaking laid out the case against Arthur Lee Allen one more time. None of it, so far, has been enough to officially close this case. And honestly, I don't know if it ever will be. The men who worked this case from the beginning are mostly gone now. Dave Toschi died in 2018. Don Fuch died a few years ago. Robert Graysmith, the cartoonist who wrote the original book, is in his 80s. Time is winning. But here is the thing, and this is what I keep coming back to. We did get something out of all of this. The Z340 cipher cracked open after 51 years of silence. The skull in the mountains finally got a name. And we learned what the Zodiac was actually trying to tell us, even if it was nothing we wanted to hear. He was telling us he wasn't afraid. He was telling us he didn't fear the gas chamber. He was telling us he believed his victims would serve him in some afterlife he had invented for himself. He was telling us in his own way that he expected to win. And for 56 years, he has. Anyone who has spent any real time with this case eventually has to sit with that fact. The Zodiac probably died of natural causes a long time ago. He probably died in a hospital bed somewhere, surrounded by family, his identity intact. Maybe his children visited him. Maybe his grandchildren did. Nobody ever sent the police. And the families of the people he killed, the ones who are still alive, have spent the last 5.5 decades watching the system not catch him, watching the cipher get solved without giving up a name, watching the FBI eliminate suspects with DNA tests that didn't match anyone in particular. That is the part of this case that is hardest to make peace with. Not that he got away. Plenty of killers get away. It's that he got away and then watched the world try to catch him for 50 years and laughed about it on the way out the door. That is what the Z340 cipher told us in the end. I want to leave you with one detail, because it has stayed with me all the way through this case, and I think about it every time I read the file. On the night of the 20th of December, 1968, David Faraday rang the doorbell at the Jensen home at 8 o'clock in the evening. He shook Mr. Jensen's hand. He met Betty Lou's mother. He had only known their daughter for 2 weeks. He had met her at a church function. He liked her enough to cut classes during the day to come see her. That night was their first date. The first one. Before he drove off, he promised the Jensens he would have her home by 11. The Jensens stood at the door and watched their daughter leave. And then they sat down in their living room. And they waited up. They tried not to look at the clock too often. 11 came. 11:15. The phone didn't ring. There were no headlights in the driveway. They were still sitting there when they heard about the murders the next morning. Their daughter had been 16 years old. She had worn a purple dress with a Christmas bell pinned to her white collar. She had never been on a date before that night. She had asked her sister for advice. She had brought the boy home to meet her parents, the way she had been taught to do. And the Zodiac took her. He took David. He took Darlene Ferrin, the mother of a baby girl named Dina, who never knew her. He took Cecilia Shepherd, who had been born in a small village in southern India and had wanted to be a teacher. He took Paul Stein, the doctoral student driving a cab, to pay his tuition. 5 people. 2 survivors who carried it for the rest of their lives, families who waited for answers that never fully came, a skull in the mountains that took 53 years to get a name, a code that took 51 years to speak, and a man who walked into the night in Presidio Heights and was never seen again. If you remember any of this, the way some of you watching this will remember the headlines from 1969 and 1970, remember those names: David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepherd, Paul Stein, Donna Lass. They were the people the Zodiac took from us. Their parents waited up. That's the part of this story I will never stop thinking about. 2 parents in a small house in Benicia, California, sitting in their living room on the night of December 20th, 1968, watching the clock pass 11, knowing in their gut that something had gone wrong. And waiting for a daughter who was never going to walk back through that door. They were waiting for her on her first date.